You know, I never do multiple takes on videos, but this is going to be my third take for this, because I haven't been able to really articulate what I wanted to say. America is in much more danger right now, and by America I should say the United States government. The current regime in Washington is in much more danger right now than anyone I think is really saying. I've said in the past that I did not think that the United States had the requisite level of social cohesion in order to survive the next economic depression. I stand by that statement, and I will elaborate on that for those who haven't been following this channel for multiple years. But if you go back to what I said a couple days ago in a video, I can't remember the exact title, but the thumbnail said "No oil, no economy." It was basically talking about how what is going on in the oil market right now, combination, the lack of capital expenditure in oil markets, and the Russian embargo, which is going to hit Europe and then have a ripple effects throughout the West and will affect the United States. That will necessarily lead to a new Great Depression, because less oil means less economic output. That depression may very well be the match which ignites the tinderbox that is the modern United States. The United States is not a nation state, as I've pointed out in the past. We do not have any sort of ethnic or cultural binders that unite the 50 states as, one nation. The legitimacy of the United States federal government is based upon results, really. It's based upon a confidence in the competency of our American elites. It's based on a confidence in the competence of our federal institutions, both of which have been severely degraded, rightfully, in the eyes of the American people over the past few years. People are much more skeptical of these agencies and of these elites than ever before. Essentially, I argue that the American government derives its legitimacy from the standard of living of the average American. As our standards of living have remained higher relative to our level of production in this country, essentially we've been getting a lot for free, I'll put it that way, as a result of the exorbitant privilege granted to us by virtue of having the world's reserve currency. I don't want to get too much into that, but the basic idea is we can run trade deficits, which means that we're importing more than we're exporting year after year without encountering any problems other than the social problem of hollowing out your industry. But all else equal, that trade deficit can continue because we have the world reserve currency. And so that grants us Americans much higher standards of living than we otherwise would have when you look at the level of output of our economy. But now it appears we're moving into an era where the average American's access to scarce resources is going to be limited. Our standard of living is going to decline. And when that happens, the federal government will be in extreme danger because there is no real underlying loyalty for the regime. People don't love the government. A lot of people hate the government. Some people do love the government. Your average MSNBC viewer, your average CNN viewer. But those people represent a small minority of the country, and they're concentrated in a few coastal cities. And so those who are loyal to the regime at this point represent certainly not a majority, but not even a plurality of the American population. There may be a quarter, to be generous. 75% of Americans, I would say, given the opportunity, would be open to different political arrangements. If, one, their life was made particularly difficult by the U.S. federal government, and they were given some kind of reasonable alternative in which they could believe that their standards of living had reason to improve. Now, in the past, I have war-gamed out the breakup of America, which I think is something that's quite possible because of the underlying social tensions, the lack of social cohesion, the breakdown in any sort of a national culture, which was always artificial. I've always thought that the most likely spark would be a financial crisis, that not a supply side shock, but rather, just interest rates going up for whatever reason, either because the Fed raised them, probably not, maybe because inflation pushed up interest rates. We have inflation now, but we have very negative real rates. But either way, the basic idea is higher interest rates mean that the federal government would default necessarily because of the tremendous amount of debt that the U.S. government currently has. The cost of servicing that debt is based off of the rate of interest. With near zero interest rates, the cost of servicing that debt is quite low, but quite substantial as a percentage of the overall U.S. budget. But interest rates would only have to move slightly up in order for the cost of servicing that debt to exceed the tax receipts that the federal government takes in on any given year, and therefore the federal government would be bankrupt. As of right now, I don't think that that's an immediate possibility. I don't think that what we're about to see is a huge surge in Treasury yields, which will drive the federal government into bankruptcy. No, what we're looking at now is an energy crisis so substantial that the federal government can very credibly be believed by the average American, and I would share this view, I think, when it comes to it, that the federal government is doing much more harm to the Americans' living standards than good, i.e. by imposing environmental regulations and emission standards and all these things that drive up the cost of energy, that negatively impact the supply of energy, that Washington is making us all poorer, which I think would be a very reasonable point of view. And so the easiest step forward from there would be to nullify federal energy regulations and all these things, and just start trying to extract energy and import energy from abroad against the will of the federal government. This is something that would be overwhelmingly popular within states if they're experiencing, let's say, $10 a gallon for gas, and their governor comes out and says, you know what, we're not going to wait for the federal government. We're just going to start drilling for oil ourselves. We're going to build a new oil refinery, these sorts of things. People would cheer that. And if the feds came in and tried to shut it down, first of all, what are they going to do? Send in the tanks to blow up oil wells? I think you also could see state governments try to cut their own deals with foreign governments to import energy, again going around the federal government. And this would only happen if the federal government is as intransigent and slow to react as it typically is. This is just sort of like a water, flowing the path of least resistance kind of idea. The American economy needs energy to work. The federal government, part of what they do is secure an adequate supply of energy to fuel the American economy. If they don't do that, that oil is going to get to the people who need it one way or another. People are going to find a way to get that oil. And so whether that's by drilling for it in America or importing it from other countries, even if the federal government doesn't go along with it, this will happen in due time. Because as the feds are increasingly viewed as incompetent and counterproductive, people will not respect their authority. And this will not be limited to energy. I think that the energy crisis may be just what sparks this. As I said, we're a tinderbox. People have plenty of reason already to not like the federal government and to not trust them. But what they haven't had as of yet is a real clear and unavoidable reason to revolt. At the end of the day, governments, even dictatorships, derive their power from the consent of the governed, whether it be implicit or explicit. And by consent to the government, I don't mean that everything is democratic or whatever. It's far from it. What I mean is that people are willing to go along with it. They're willing to work within that system because they think that it's in their best interests and that there's not a better alternative. Americans, work together, so to speak, because they think that it's in their best interests. But if people in America start getting poor, if they see their standards of living starting to decline, well, then they might think to themselves, gee, we might have a better way of going about this. It's that simple, because states don't exist in a state of nature. A state needs a reason to exist. And the United States of America has been losing its reason to exist for a long time now. It just hasn't it hasn't degraded to such an extent yet that it has ceased to exist. But I and many others, like Ron Paul, have always said that, if America comes apart, it's going to look something like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union one day just collapsed under its own weight. Once it became clear that the institutions of the Soviet Union, of the united government, were not having positive effects, that there really was no need for them, they faded away and disappeared. Up until now, the United States government has been dysfunctional. It's been corrupt. But at the end of the day, it has worked to a certain degree. It's worked that either because of or in spite of its existence, Americans have enjoyed a relatively very high standard of living compared to much of the rest of the planet. People have been able to own homes and cars, and they've been able to, a lot of them, get a nice job and support their families. Now, people like me would argue that the federal government in Washington has made all of that much more difficult. But at the end of the day, people were still able to achieve those things. If our standards of living drop here in America, people are going to blame their political opponents. That's the nature of the modern American culture war. The right will blame the left, and the left will blame the right. I'm not saying that either one of them are correct or that it's not more complicated than that. But the fact is, we have a country of people who don't get along very well with each other, who have contempt for one another, and are basically held together by their collective prosperity. When that prosperity goes away, all you're left with is a country filled with people who don't like each other. And if you have a country filled with people who don't like each other, they probably will decide, you know what? I have nothing to lose. I don't think I want to be a part of a country with these people anymore. And that's why, if you want to strengthen the United States government and its institutions, the most important thing that you can do is try and guarantee and prop up the standard of living of the average person. If you keep people fat and happy, they will tolerate being called a Nazi, white supremacist. They will tolerate you grooming their children into whatever sexual cults you're affiliated with. They will tolerate being gaslit. They will tolerate being derided by the people on the evening news, as long as, at the end of the day, their real life, their reality is comfortable. And right now, of course, I'm talking about more the right wanting to separate itself out from the federal system. You could very easily see this on the left, too. If you get, let's say, something extreme like a second Trump presidency. So at the end of the day, we don't have a very bright future, and I think that we'll look back at this time and see it as an important step in the decline of the United States. I don't know where they'll mark the beginning of the end. Knowing historians, they'll probably mark the beginning of the end with, like, Trump's election or something stupid like that. But no matter where you want to say it started, things are getting worse. We're getting closer to the end. All of these measures, which will contribute to the coming economic catastrophe, make it more likely that this country will meet its demise, not less likely. Every year that goes by, people have less and less reason to be loyal to the U.S. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.